In 1997, at the age of about 14, I got really into PS1 races like Formula 1 97, Colin McRae Rally and TOCA touring cars. Before that, racing games had been something I'd played in short bursts at arcades or arcade ports on my Mega Drive. These PS1 racing games did away with a lot of the arcade tropes like timers and checkpoints, and sought to accurately recreate the racing you would watch on television, often with licensed teams, drivers and even sponsors on the HUD. Obviously, looking back now, it doesn't exactly scream photorealism, but at the time it might as well have been. Although my main sport is football, it's been these racing games, not the likes of Pro Evo or FIFA, that I've bought on a regular basis ever since. Finally, after close to 25 years, I've taken my love of racing games to the next level by purchasing a steering wheel and pedal set. Initially, I only intended to use it for the games I'd already been playing in some form or another for years, like Formula 1, Rally and Gran Turismo. However, I ended up going down a rabbit hole of racing sims and uncovering a subgenre that is going from strength to strength. Sim racing is excellent right now. Wheel and pedal sets are better than ever, frame rates and graphics are good enough that games look close to real, and hardware can simulate driving down to the tiniest details. The increased popularity of sim racing equipment means developers can justify spending more time on things like force feedback for wheels, which in turn makes the experience even better, and it starts to become a self-fulfilling cycle. While the genre is still niche, there's a lot of competition in the space, and with a couple of exceptions that I will discuss later, the games haven't been ruined by microtransactions, loot boxes and battle passes. I nearly always feel like I'm getting great value for money. Sim racing also pushes technical boundaries and has latched onto VR with a passion. Racing is one of the few genres that can make the switch to VR without having to change the nature of the experience. VR, when done well, is an excellent addition to racing, not a novelty thrown on top of a system that wasn't built with it in mind. In this video I'll discuss what I love about sim racing and hopefully inspire a few people to give it a shot. First though, you might be wondering what I mean by sim racing. It's actually not as straightforward as it sounds. During this video I'll no doubt discuss F1, WRC and Gran Turismo more than the likes of Assetto Corsa and iRacing. Partly that's because I've played the former for years, where I've only just started with the latter. But it's also because I simply prefer playing them, for the time being at least. To some people that makes this entire video irrelevant and not about sim racing at all, because games like F1 have been given the unofficial label Simcade due to their blend of simulation and arcade features. When sim racing fans use the term Simcade, they generally mean it as a slur. They say it in a way that somehow rhymes with filthy casual, like you know what they mean when they say it. I can kind of see where this attitude comes from, but I don't like the term Simcade and prefer to use Simlight to describe the likes of WRC or Gran Turismo. I think we all know a pure arcade racer when we see one. The Burnout and Need for Speed games usually. The cars may look like real models, but they don't drive like them at all, damage isn't a thing, there are typically speed boosts, and for some reason driving around corners sideways helps maintain speed. Arcade races are about winning at all costs, and the extent of the difficulty depends on the elasticity of the rubber banding. They usually don't have in-car views either. A simulation racer, on the face of it, attempts to replicate the real experience of driving a car as best it can. Games like F1 clearly try to do that, and I think a label that implies they are even on the spectrum of arcade racers is inaccurate. Simcade is a good description for franchises like Dirt, which was initially a Colin McRae spin-off, Grid, a TOCA spin-off, and maybe even Forza Horizon, although that is pushing more towards arcade. Arcade-like maybe. No, let's not open that can of worms. In those games you drive real cars, and even if they aren't intimately familiar with the laws of physics, they've at least read a few books and watched a TED talk on the concept. You won't find so many random speed boosts, for example, and you can probably use an in-car view to drive. However, there's still a focus on winning races or coming in the top 3 as the only form of progression, and those races are generally scripted to be close until the last second. Car damage is limited and you generally drive with an aggressive attitude, throwing the car into corners, ignoring brushes with walls and maybe even nudging other cars to get them out of the way without worrying about damage. You may even get XP rewards for doing so. And importantly for this video, Simcade games often feel much better on controller. Playing Horizon on a wheel just feels innately wrong, and even the likes of Dirt and Grid don't feel quite right with a wheel because the games do too much of the work for you. Although I still enjoy arcade races, I'm not a massive fan of Simcade games because I find they straddle the line of sim and arcade a little awkwardly. They're neither one thing nor the other. I have to remind my brain to take more risks when driving, but not too many. The lack of any specialisation means they rarely nail any one driving style. The latest Grid game was a great example of this. It doesn't know the type of game it wants to be. I do enjoy the Horizon games, although usually only for around 10 hours or so. Eventually the rubber banding and general fakeness of it all starts to put me off. Unfortunately, the way progression works in Simcade games means they are a natural fit for obnoxious microtransactions and loot boxes, and every race tends to end in you being showered with multiple currencies and rewards. Compare this to Sim-like games. While they typically have accessibility options that let you adjust the controls and assists to such an extent that the experience isn't even close to being a simulation, that clearly isn't the intended way to play. The F1 games are close enough to the real experience that Formula 1 drivers use the game to practice and learn track layouts, although clearly not as the main way they practice. They have somewhat more expensive simulators available too, and some drivers do prefer the likes of iRacing for practice. Sim-like games don't usually make you unlock cars, with the exception of Gran Turismo, although with most of those games that's more about simulating the experience of earning money and progressing that way, like simulating real life, so to speak. The Formula 1 games now have microtransactions, unfortunately, although the good news is that they are so terrible they are easily ignored. It's just bad paint jobs and new gloves and the like. And in sim-like games you don't want to be making contact with the walls, and although you can nudge other cars a bit in some car classes, you will typically pay the price in resulting damage. Still, I won't go as far as to call these full sims, because when you play games like Assetto Corsa Competizione or iRacing, you immediately notice a difference in how the cars feel and how the more commercial projects shave off the edges in the name of a more accessible experience. Going from a regular F1 game to Assetto Corsa with F1 modded in is an eye-opening experience and does make you feel like you've been racing with the training wheels on. As we'll see, I prefer sim-like games overall, at least at the moment, because those little bells and whistles you get with a more commercial product do add to the experience for me, especially with things like career modes. Sim racers sometimes feel a little too self-serious. That said, the more I play, the more I feel myself switching over. The best thing about sim racing is the sense of immersion and how easy it is to lose yourself in a good race. Unlike most genres, the racing experience translates naturally to video games, because when driving you are just sat there with your hands on a wheel and your feet on pedals, and that's what you can do in games if you have the setup. For all the talk of immersion with big RPGs, for example, chances are you're sat there with a controller or mouse and keyboard and you're not all that connected to the actions your character is taking on screen. Sim racing rewards you for sitting on your ass. This does present an interesting issue around the camera though. Ever since the PS1 days, I have preferred playing in cockpit view where possible for the most realistic experience, although it does tend to be harder to play that way, and in close races I would switch to a chase cam. When trying to recreate actual driving, the behind the car views are not usually a good option. Nowadays I mainly use an in-car view of some kind. My preference is for a camera just in front of the steering wheel, like a dash cam, because I can already see my own wheel. However, I also use a regular cockpit view or even a helmet cam at times, which is incredibly restrictive. And other times I use a hood cam. It really does depend on the game. Most sim games give you a lot of camera flexibility, so you can work out how far you're sitting from your monitor and pretend that is the windscreen. iRacing, a game centred around its competitive online multiplayer, forces its players into a cockpit view. The F1 games are an exception. I love the cockpit views, they look stunning and the on-screen wheels are basically the same as real ones, but damn, they make it difficult to race, even if you adjust the thickness of the halo piece in the middle of the screen. At the risk of making excuses, this view is a bit much, especially if you do play with just one monitor. You have way less visibility than an actual F1 driver would have. I usually use the TV cam, and so do the vast majority of esports F1 racers. I try to go back into the cockpit regularly though, just for the immersion. While difficult, the view is spectacular for tracks with lots of uphill and downhill sections like Brazil. You feel the slopes so much more and it does enhance the experience. Rally is an interesting one. I default to the dash cam in WRC games, but one day I was having so many problems with a tight track I decided to use the chase cam view to get a better idea of how much space I had or didn't have around the car. It was rough at first, like using this view with a wheel requires a bit of a mental disconnect and it takes some getting used to. But I did get used to it and started to actively enjoy it. I still prefer dash cam, but on tracks like Monte Carlo I don't hesitate to mix things up a bit and I enjoy the change of pace. Sim racing has fully embraced VR. Sim light racing not so much. Most of the full simulation racers have VR and it's good. Assetto Corsa Competizione probably has the best, but it's also incredibly demanding on your PC as you'd expect. I'm still getting my VR legs a bit, so I don't use it for long stretches of time, but I do enjoy it. I'm using an Oculus Quest 2 connected to my PC with a wire, which when added to the wires for my wheel, pedals and sometimes headphones means I look like I'm hooked up to a prototype version of the Matrix when playing. It's a little cumbersome, but overall one of the best VR experiences I've had. Again, racing is a great fit for this. I mean, you're supposed to be sat down and not moving in relation to your vehicle. I sometimes throw a fan on to simulate air from outside the car, which helps with nausea a bit. I'm still not at the point where VR is the main way I play, but it's definitely not a novelty either, and some people genuinely do only race in VR. Which brings us to a problem. While the full simulation games have embraced VR, the sim light games have largely not. Fans have been crying out for Codemasters to add VR to the Formula 1 games for years and still no dice. Maybe that will change with additional EA money, but I think it's a few years off. Likewise, the WRC games don't have VR, although I must admit that the idea of rally racing in VR holds little appeal, especially the way I drive. I get a distinct impression I will try it once and feel sick for a week. Still, it should be added for those with stronger constitutions. Gran Turismo Sport has VR, although that is only for the PSVR headset obviously, and I've heard it's not great. If you're on PC, Project Cars 2 is probably the only decent sim lights option with VR. Clearly a big part of the immersive experience is the setup, which consists of a wheel and set of pedals, plus some sort of frame to put them on. As with most hobbies, you can spend ridiculous amounts of money on this if you want, but there are also affordable setups that get you most of the way there. I went with Thrustmaster's T300 RS Gran Turismo version, which costs $400. Logitech used to be the budget option, but its new offering costs $400 too. At the premium end, you have the likes of Fanatec, which will probably set you back over $1,000 and then some. They look very impressive, but it's a big leap from the $400 I paid, and given that this was my first wheel, I didn't want to go overboard. I wanted an H-stick shifter as well, but they were expensive, and really most cars use paddle shifters these days, even rally cars, so it's hardly a necessity. While I bought a bundle, these setups are largely modular, so I can buy new wheels to attach to my base if I want. Thrustmaster recently put out a stunning looking Formula 1 wheel. Needless to say, I'd love one of these, although it costs almost as much as my entire setup did. I was lucky to buy my wheel when I did. In addition to supply shortages driving up the price, it looks like Thrustmaster is leaving the more affordable end of the market. Its new Gran Turismo wheel set retails for $800, twice the price of the one I bought. Sure, it's a better wheel, but it doesn't look like it justifies a 100% price increase. For that price, I'd expect the trim here to be metal, not plastic for a start. Logitech is sure looking like the best value right now. I should also note that I had problems with my wheel and with Thrustmaster's customer support. I rant for a bit here, so feel free to use the timestamps to skip ahead. The right paddle on my wheel was soft and didn't have an audible or tactile click when reaching the gear change point. In Formula 1 cars in particular, you often need to upshift quickly and a couple of times in succession. It's important to have some kind of feedback for a gear change. I told Thrustmaster and they agreed it was a product fault and sent me a new wheel. This took a while, but it was coming from Canada and COVID was delaying deliveries, plus it's not exactly an essential item, like first world problems and all that. When the wheel arrived, it was the wrong model. It was a regular PlayStation edition instead of GT. This doesn't matter for performance and appearance doesn't bother me, but it's a bit annoying because it means if I ever want to sell the wheel, I have to explain why the wheel doesn't match the box. The real issue though was that the new wheel had the same problem. In fact, it was even worse. The right paddle was spongy with no feedback and the left wasn't great either. Now, clearly there's a manufacturing problem causing this, so I got in touch with Thrustmaster again, who said they'd send out a new one and asked me to return the one they just sent me, which I did. A good month or so later I got the new replacement wheel. Once again it was the wrong model, and once again it had broken paddles. This was just too much. I started the return process again and was planning to be much less polite in my email to customer service, which in my case means only apologising once for bothering them with my problem. I knew they'd need the serial number because they did last time, so I took a photo and noticed something odd. The serial number was the same as the last wheel. Thrustmaster had waited for me to return the defective wheel and then sent the same one back to me. Anyway, I'm spending way too long on this. They apologised, sent me another wheel, still the wrong model and still with crappy paddles, and I've now just accepted they have poor quality control and I'm going to live with it. I'm still happy with the product overall, and given recent price increases I do feel like I've gotten value for money. I just don't feel comfortable recommending Thrustmaster without a big caveat. I'm sure the new stuff is good, I'd hope so at that price, but buyer beware. Also, God knows what my delivery driver thought of me getting a bunch of packages labelled Thrustmaster. Dread to think. Regardless of the wheel you end up with, it will likely take some time to get used to how you want it set up. In fact, I still don't really understand all the setup intricacies and just use online guides. Basic calibration of the wheel and pedals is usually not too bad, although a few games like to switch my brake and clutch pedal around for some reason, or require settings to be inverted, otherwise they think the neutral position is depressed and vice versa. However, the force feedback settings are confusing. This can be fine-tuned until your heart's content, but as a new player and one who lacks real-world experience driving racing cars, it's difficult to know how to properly tune it. I don't know what force feedback should feel like, and I certainly have no idea what to do with settings called brake gamma and gear shift denouncing. This is the advantage of buying a common wheel. Setup guides for wheels like the T300 RS go up online within hours of a game releasing. I just copy them. I have a similar problem with car setups generally. I know how to make small tweaks and adjustments, especially on the car types I race most frequently, like Formula 1. I can tell when I have an understeering problem, for example. But there are often more options than I can deal with, and it can take a long time to know if I'm on the right path with my changes. For example, if I want to compare setups in a rally car, I not only need to race a track twice to compare times, I need to race it consistently without mistakes both times. And potentially I need to do this for all the options. Fortunately, most games offer good default car setups. If the default is good, then I'm happy. I can leave it as it is or make a few tweaks. I'm not competing at the high end of leaderboards anyway. However, as we'll see, some games give you terrible default options and leave potentially inexperienced players way too many headaches. Speaking of which, I should probably talk about the actual games at some point. I'm going to start with the Sim Light games and then move on to full simulation racers. Now I have to start with the official Formula 1 games. I've loved them since 1997, and although they've had their ups and downs, the series has been incredibly consistent over the years and rarely puts out a bad entry. Annual sports titles have a terrible reputation among players. Madden, FIFA and NHL release year after year with barely more than a roster update at this point, and often even the same bugs. As Racevich pointed out in his recent video, the licensed F1 games developed by Codemasters are an exception to the rule. Of course, the publisher of those terrible sports franchises now owns Codemasters, so we'll have to see how long that lasts. The Formula 1 games are a great place for sim racing newbies to start. For one thing, the sport is easy to watch online these days, and the Drive to Survive series on Netflix does a decent job of introducing the rules and dynamics, when it's not creating false drama. The games themselves offer a lot of flexibility for how they're played and the level of realism and challenge they offer, while also being perfectly playable on a controller. That's what I did for over 2 decades. A good test for how much I enjoy a driving game is if I can play in time trial mode and have fun. In F1 I absolutely can. I often run laps for hours just trying to shave hundredths of a second off my best time. Another test is if I feel like I'm going to die when heading up Eau Rouge, and I absolutely do. Of course, the Grand Prix are where the real action lies. If you're new to sim racing, you might not realise just how fun it can be to race in the middle of the pack. Arcade racers have acclimatised us to the idea that we must win, and you might be tempted to set the difficulty at a spot that allows you to win races. Please don't. Being in the middle of the pack, or even at the back, and having to overtake other cars is just so much more fun than being out in front. The F1 games do a great job replicating just how difficult it is to overtake in real F1, which means when you do, it is incredibly satisfying. Being faster than the car in front is only the start. You have to find the perfect spot to make the overtake, gambling on whether to brake late to make it to the corner first, even if you risk running wide. On a straight, you might slowly gain on the car in front, but will you have time to make the pass before the corner? Even defending your position from a faster car or better driver feels like a win. Hell, some of the best moments from the 2021 F1 season were Alonso and Perez defending fantastically against Hamilton. The small victories are the most memorable. Being in 12th place and gradually closing the gap to the car in front while managing ERS usage until you finally get in DRS range and get the overtake just before the corner to gain 11th place before frantically looking in your mirrors as the next DRS zone comes up and you have to defend. A badly timed pit stop can ruin all your hard work, while diving into the pits just when a safety car comes out can catapult you up the positions. Real life Formula 1 is generally considered to be the biggest test of a driver's skill of all the racing disciplines. It's hard to say for certain whether that's true without someone actually having competed at the highest level in all of them, but I will say that in the context of video games they are the hardest cars to drive and master. This makes it a great way to learn the logistics of racing, because if you're doing something wrong in F1 you know about it immediately. There's simply no room for error and you have to learn the fundamentals of racing like downforce and weight distribution. For example, when you send power to the engine by accelerating, you send weight to the back of the car. That means there's less weight on the front tyres, so they're less connected to the road and have less grip. Less grip means you'll spin more than Kylie Minogue and not look anywhere near as good doing it. When accelerating out of a corner, you need to get on the accelerator very slowly, preferably while the wheels are straight. This is of course easy in theory. Anyone can coast around a corner. However, you need to push the limits because that's what every other driver is doing. One tactic is short shifting. This means going up through the gears quicker than you otherwise would, so for example, quickly going from 2nd to 4th or 5th after a slow corner. Being in too high a gear reduces the power sent to the engine and lets you put your foot down. This is easier than massaging the accelerator, for me at least. Downforce versus speed is probably the main thing to understand in F1. The game even gives you custom loadouts to choose between downforce versus speed options, and it was the most notable difference between the Red Bull and Mercedes cars in 2021. This isn't supposed to be a tutorial video, of course, and nor should it be because I only have a surface level understanding of the concepts myself. Other tactics I try to use are trail braking, where you stay on the brake while cornering, and engine braking, where you downshift early. My issue with the latter is that I haven't quite worked out how detrimental it is on the car's parts over the course of a season. While the F1 games are great for beginners, I can see why they don't quite go far enough for sim fans. For starters, the games still don't recreate even half the drama of a typical race weekend. Pit stops are always flawless and robotic, so you're never at risk of having a bad stop. Likewise, you don't get random engine failures. It's like how FIFA games never get offside decisions wrong, for example. It's probably one of those things that sounds better in theory than practice. We all think we want more realism until it means getting a puncture while I'm in front at Baku and nearly missing out on the championship title 6 months later as a result. I might be wrong on this, but I personally don't notice things like changing track temperatures during qualifying, and even though the practice sessions put a lot of emphasis on tyre and fuel management, I rarely find it an issue during races unless I go to extremes. Ultimately, races just feel a bit sterile and predictable compared to the dynamic ones in real life. I also have issues with communication during races. This is going to be a hard one to fix, but the messages from your team are incredibly vague and generic. I will happily go the rest of my life without hearing the words, "We have a new strategy available."
A new strategy is available on the MFD.
As for the driving, the experience is a little too smooth, even on rumble strips. You don't notice the problems so much until you play other games that do it better. I'll discuss them shortly. Race starts are a little too easy if you have the assist setting on, but if you turn it off, they're too difficult. I practiced a lot and looked up how to do them online and still always lose places. I like to play with traction control off, but it might actually be too hard this way. Even some F1 drivers have said medium traction control is more appropriate, so I've started using that most of the time. Racing in the rain with traction control off is nigh on impossible, and no matter what I did I couldn't get close to being competitive. I considered reducing the difficulty but instead turned the traction control to medium. Suddenly I was way better than every other car. It doesn't feel like the difficulty is balanced at all in the rain actually. Speaking of which, some tracks are so much harder than others, well for me at least, and always have been. No matter what difficulty I'm playing on, I always have to lower it a lot on the street circuits like Monaco. I'm not entirely sure what it is about these tracks, and maybe it is just me, but it feels inconsistent. I've tried different cars, different setups, but it doesn't help. For newcomers, I think F1 could do a better job teaching the intricacies of the sport. The games do teach you how to use DRS and ERS, manage fuel, manage tyres, etc., but they don't really explain when to use ERS, for example, or what to look out for on the tyre HUD element when considering tyre wear. When and why should you change pit stop strategies, etc. There's a lot of in-race information available, and trying to work out what it means at 200 miles an hour is a tough ask. Engine parts wear out over a number of races, so if you're doing something wrong you might not notice it until race 5 when you've knackered your engine. Most of this stuff is manageable to me because I've been watching the sport for almost 30 years, but for newcomers it must be a lot to adjust to. Codemasters is clearly trying to bring in new players and not just cater to the hardcore. The new single player mode, Breaking Point, is basically a playable version of Drive to Survive. The PG-13 nature of the story feels weirdly quaint next to the much more dramatic events of real life. Some of the scenarios you play out, like limping back to the pits with a puncture, are fun, because you don't usually experience that during races. However, way too many of the scenarios are just things like catch up to your teammate, at which point the game takes over and does the cool stuff in a cutscene. Like, I get why Breaking Point is the way it is, and at the moment it feels like a bonus mode rather than what I'm paying for, so I don't really care. But unless I hear about significant improvements, I probably won't bother playing it in next year's release. For the career modes, you can manage a team now while being a driver. As a team manager, you control the team's colours and logo, hire a co-driver, sign deals with sponsors, direct R&D, and upgrade the car. It sounds more interesting than it really is. There's not much depth to it, and once I got used to what needed doing, it was barely more than a 5-minute distraction between race weekends. If you don't want to deal with team stuff, there's a mode where you can just be the driver in the team with much less management. While the team mode is a touch shallow, the structure is enough to keep me coming back for multiple seasons, so it is doing something right. Just seeing my team gradually improve and move from the bottom to the top over a period of years is really cool, even if the process of buying the unlocks is a little basic. The hardest part is having the patience to stick with it while you're racing at the back for entire seasons. There's been an effort to make you feel part of the team, with emails from your crew about the weather and their expectations for you during the race, but it rarely adds much. Post-race interviews have you choose which department to heap praise on and have been the same for years now. You start skipping past this stuff quite quickly. There are a few gems in there. I did like seeing an email about the Austrian circuit where an engineer got confused between turn 2 and turn 3 because turn 2 is basically a straight. It's literally the same mistake I often make when referring to that corner. Depending on exactly which entry you buy, there may also be a bunch of classic cars to mess around with, which are sometimes incorporated into the career as part of invitational weekends. Some of them are huge nostalgia throwbacks and fun to mess around with. The career modes in F1 are probably the best of all the games discussed here, while leaving a lot of room for improvement. That probably says more about those other games than this one. My rally game of choice right now is the latest in the WRC series. Rally racing has been inconsistent over the past 20 years. The F1 games have changed developers over the years, but there's nearly always an annual entry with the F1 name. Rally is more scattered. There were the excellent Colin McRae games, which kind of merged into Dirt, plus V-Rally and Sega Rally for a few years, and classics like Richard Burns Rally, which purists will tell you is still the best. The WRC games themselves have been through 2 iterations, starting in 2001 and then being rebooted in 2010. KT Racing took over development duties with WRC 5, and after a rough start they hit a winning formula from about WRC 8 onwards. It's therefore a shame that the rally licence is passing to Codemasters from 2023. It's not that Codemasters won't do a good job necessarily. Dirt Rally 2.0 is arguably the better rally game right now, but my fear is a licensed Codemasters rally game, published by EA, will be closer to the regular Dirt games than Dirt Rally. For those who don't know the difference, the main Dirt entries are much closer to the Simcade label than Sim Lite. Dirt 5 was especially egregious in this respect. Anyway, the WRC games are in a great place, and as with F1, they're a good starting point for sim racing newbies, and they can be enjoyed with a controller. Rally is an odd sport. In many ways, it's even more demanding and exhilarating than F1, but neither the real-world sport nor the games get the same attention as F1, and I think that's largely because it's all about racing the clock. Rally is essentially just a time trial mode. Now, I still love the sport, but it's a harder sell than F1. You can't just tune in for a 90-minute race. You have to watch for 3 entire days as every driver runs 20 stages with a cumulative timer determining the winner. Still, it's an undeniably impressive sport, and the WRC games do a great job recreating the insanity of driving flat out on uneven terrain, where hitting a loose rock can send you flying off the track, or potentially off the edge of a cliff. It's a completely different type of challenge. Usually in racing games the challenge lies in cornering. That's where time is won and lost, assuming cars are of equal power. Racing therefore becomes about braking distances, apexes and throttle management. However, in rally the corners are kind of the easy part. Like, sharper the better for me. It's the straights or sections with only slight bends that pose the real threat. You need to maintain high speed while also making tiny adjustments, being thrown up in the air and generally just fighting against the track, which treats you like an unwelcome guest who's not taking the hint to go home. Hairpins are easy. Navigating the slight kink to the right at 150 miles an hour while also staying in the centre of a narrow track to avoid brick walls on either side, that's much harder. The tricky part about rally racing is fighting the instinct to play it safe. It doesn't feel natural to push cars that hard and always be on the edge of losing control, or to make massive turns with the wheel instead of slight adjustments. WRC is the only racing game in this video that makes my Fitbit think I've gone for a run. I've been killing my step goal lately, and you have to do all this with basically no track knowledge. Rally racing isn't about knowing the tracks or braking points. Instead, you rely on instructions from your all-important co-driver who tells you how sharp the next corner is, as well as other useful information, such as whether it narrows or widens, whether you can get away with a small cut on entry, and even my sexual preferences.
Into Kings?
The tracks take place in the locations the real WRC goes to, although the stages aren't exact replicas. They can't be. The actual rally covers hundreds of miles. These capture the spirit of the locations though. Snowy Sweden, the awe-inspiring open Kenyan circuit that WRC returned to this year where you actually race past giraffes, and narrow technical tracks like Monte Carlo. The latter are pure tests of skill. They are incredibly tight and damage taken from slight knocks to the car will quickly add up. This is another cool thing about the WRC games actually. The cars take and sustain significant damage. There are even special race modes that put you in beat up cars and task you with dragging the thing to the finish line. I might be misremembering, but damage was never a huge problem in the older rally games. Roads were wider with fewer obstacles near the edges. The WC games are pretty strict on damage unless you adjust the settings. You can survive a couple of knocks, but for the most part you need to drive really clean. You only have a limited amount of time to repair damage between stages, and problems with the car quickly snowball. If you can't control the car properly because, say, you've knackered the suspension, you're going to hit more walls, which damages the car more, which in turn makes it harder to control. This can be frustrating early on, but WRC rewards the effort you put in to improve, and it never feels like a chore because the racing experience is so good. My only real complaint is that while the driving physics are great, the physics when interacting with the environment are not. The tracks are stunning to look at though, especially from a small team, and bearing in mind the nature of the sport means you have to go for quantity over quality more than usual. WRC's problems stem largely from the experience outside racing. Now, it's not the game's fault that you don't race people on track, but that doesn't mean you couldn't do more to inject a bit of personality into proceedings. The AI drivers are boringly consistent, so there's little variation on the leaderboards, and you can tell their performance isn't based on anyone actually racing the tracks. They aren't affected by extreme conditions like the sun blinding you as you crest a corner, or low light conditions generally. It is not easy to race at night in these games. It's probably a little overly dark, come to think of it, but that doesn't bother the AI. I think the track times the AI sets are just calculations based on length of the track, corner type and surface. They aren't based on anyone actually racing and seeing what are reasonable times for each difficulty. It works both ways though. The AI is terrible at hairpin corners, so on tracks with a bunch of switchbacks I can make up loads of time without even really trying or being good. They also struggle with snow. This all means that race difficulty is wildly inconsistent and it's hard to know if you're racing at an appropriate level. One race will be too easy, the next too hard. There is one stage mode where you race directly against an AI car that you can see, but the mode is broken. Your opponent is tuned to race a certain time regardless of your difficulty, but that time won't then match the end result. I can lose to the car I'm technically racing by say 10 seconds, and then be told I've won by 20 seconds. WRC's career mode is inspired by F1's, but it's actually even more limited. First of all, you can't jump straight into WRC cars. You have to start in either Junior WRC or WRC3 and work your way up. I enjoyed the progression the first time, but I don't know if I want to do it every year. Sometimes I'd rather start as a WRC underdog and work my way up within that car. It can be tough to switch between the car classes. I started a new Junior WRC career with WRC10, but it took me a while to unlearn what I knew about driving the WRC cars. I got used to it, but then I went back to WRC cars to capture footage for this video and had a hell of a time trying to race them. Actually, Rally is so different to the other classes that I always struggle going back. The footage in this video is frankly terrible, which is frustrating because when I devote myself to Rally, it's actually my best genre. It also doesn't help that the force feedback stopped working with this game and the recording quality is just bad anyway, regardless of how high I set the bitrate. I'm really not doing justice to how good this game is to play, so sorry about that. The most disappointing part of the career mode is how the XP system is handled. You earn XP through race performance and by completing challenges. The challenges are terrible. Some are ridiculously easy and almost hard not to complete, like don't spend too much on repairs or keep morale above a certain level, but others threaten to completely ruin your race, like don't use hard tyres for 2 rallies. Like they simply aren't comparable. Failing challenges affects team morale, so it's not just about lost XP. There's a low cap for team morale, so you can gain loads but have it not count for anything, and then they do the subtractions last. You can win a race and basically be brilliant, but end up with less morale than you started because you failed some nonsensical challenge. I was threatened with the sack after coming second and third in my first 2 rallies. I don't love the system for spending XP either. There are 4 types of upgrade available, 2 are car improvements and 2 are team improvements. I wish this was separate, like having you spend XP to improve your car and then maybe morale points to improve the team. It's hard to compare the decision to upgrade your meteorologist to improving tyre durability. There's a staff recruitment system, but it's not much more than selecting the one with the highest number. You even have to take days off to give staff a rest, which is a shame because there are cool events to take part in on your non-rally days. The actual races are good, although there are some amateur mistakes here too. For example, the first thing you have to do on race day is choose your tyre allocation, but you can't see what races you have scheduled because it's behind the menu and you have to confirm the selection before the menu will go away. I mean, how do I know how many hard tyres I'm going to need if I can't see how long the stages are? I don't think KT Racing is far off a great game here. I mean, they've nailed the hardest parts, namely the driving and the stages. The presentation and career modes should be fixable, although that said there wasn't much of an improvement between WRC 9 and 10, so I'm not going to get my hopes up. These stages are a joy to race on, and WRC is much more welcoming to new players than Dirt Rally 2, which I found tough to get into. Another 90s series that has a fond place in my heart is the Gran Turismo series. I loved the first 3 in particular. They came out when I still had the time and inclination to slowly progress through all those license tests, buy crappy cars and earn the money to buy upgrades until it was maxed out, at which point I'd repeat the process with a slightly less crappy car. I even got quite into tweaking car setups, probably more so than I have with any other game. Despite my love for the series, I'm not going to dwell too much on the latest entry, Gran Turismo Sport. I think that's fair given that Polyphony Digital clearly didn't bother with it too much either. It's severely lacking compared to mainline entries, and I'd usually describe it as a stopgap, except I'm not sure that term is suitable for what is looking like being a 9-year gap between Gran Turismo 6 and 7. To be fair, the track and car selection in Sport is decent now. It has over 350 cars and something like 80 tracks, depending on how generous you are with including variations. For context though, Gran Turismo 5 and 6 had over 1,000 cars. The driving is still good though. I just miss the sense of progression I got from the main games. You unlock cars basically at random now and don't have to slowly work your way up to the best models. I suppose cars can't be too hard to unlock because that would spoil the online component, which is clearly where the focus lies. And that online is good, really good actually. GT Sport has a sportsmanship system which rates your driving behaviour during races. If you do silly things like crash into people or generally don't take the race seriously, you lose license points and eventually no one will want to play with you anymore. The system works fairly well from my experience and you're practically guaranteed a good quality race. Even at my low skill level I can join races and be competitive enough to have a good time and get top 5 finishes. While the soundtrack isn't quite as epic as older entries, I still enjoy the basic act of driving around tracks in time trial mode and find it strangely therapeutic. This depends on car choice of course, but typically you don't need the split-second timing like you do in Formula 1, and you can let your mind drift a bit. It resembles going for a Sunday afternoon drive. The car models are a bit plain compared to other games in this list, although that's probably to be expected given how old the hardware is. The hood view camera is especially bad and makes the front of the car look weirdly disproportioned. I'd probably have played more of GT Sport after buying the wheel, but at this point I'm waiting for GT7 to really jump in. That is going to be a big game for me, and if it's half decent, could end up being the one I devote most time to in 2022. Last of the Sim Light games is Project Cars 2. At least I think it's a Sim Light. I'm not too sure where this one sits. Project Cars 2 is kind of a jack of all trades, master of some. Project Cars 2 has so much content that it could feasibly be the only racing game you need own. And if you like the idea of slow and steady progression, you're definitely covered. You can start off with karting and work your way through everything from Formula cars to GT3 to prototypes. There are 60 tracks or 140 odd layouts, including some specifically catering to classes like karting, so you don't have to run karts around huge tracks. And most of this content is included in structured tournaments that take you from the slower, easier models of each class to the faster ones, so you can gradually work your way up through the GT classes, for example. Project Cars 2 looks incredible, especially the weather effects. The VR is a beast too, and I really like the in-car cameras and helmet cams. While Project Cars 2 is more sim-light than full sim, it does have some oddly specific features like bald spots on tyres if you lock up, and altitude effects. I didn't notice the latter, although I'm pretty sure I could feel a bald spot on my tyres, which was cool. Or perhaps I just imagined it because I knew it was a thing. There are really only 2 major problems with the game, but they are biggies. First is that while Project Cars 2 could be a great beginner game due to its accessibility and plethora of options, it has issues with default car setups that mean some cars need a lot of work to drive in any way intuitively. Of course, there's no real way of knowing which setups are good and which aren't, so you have to persevere long enough to realise it's a problem with the car and not you. Each car has default setups vaguely described as stable and loose, but quite often they are both bad. I'm sure a lot of sim racers enjoy tweaking every part of the car and consider it part of the experience, but I'd rather just get on with the racing. I know this sounds casual as all hell, but I want the game to do 95% of the work for me with car setups. Leave those 5% for those who want to do the extra work, but otherwise give me a car suited to the track and conditions that I'm expected to race in. Project Cars 2's other problem is that it isn't especially well suited to the hardcore sim racing fan either, because nearly everything it offers is done better elsewhere. I prefer the F1 racing in not just the F1 games but in Assetto Corsa and Automobilista 2, and Assetto Corsa Competizione absolutely dominates the GT space at this point. Project Cars 2 is great value though, so if you want to get into sim racing but don't know what type of racing is for you, this is a good place to start. Assetto Corsa is the Skyrim of sim racers. Out of the box it's a little disappointing, but once you mod it up you can have a good time. You really do have to put the effort in though. In its regular form, Assetto Corsa, developed by Italian studio Kunos Simulazioni, is so cumbersome that modders created a desktop application to use as a launcher to replace the god-awful in-game menus, and the game's been abandoned for a few years now. As with many sim games, the career mode's nothing to write home about, just collections of races grouped together with little fanfare. The mod options are ridiculous, with some offering borderline photorealism. Of course, at this point it will come as no surprise that the mods I immediately went to were Formula 1 related. There are current season cars and tracks, which were updated for COVID changes quicker than the official game, by the way, and you can even race a proper season with full race weekends. On the track, you immediately notice why people think the F1 games are too arcadey and smooth. In Assetto Corsa, driving at high speeds and pushing these machines to the edge feels appropriately dangerous, and you're terrified you might lose control at any moment. It's not that they are unrealistically hard. Chances are you won't lose control on a straight. F1 cars have a ton of downforce at speed. But importantly, it feels like you could, and it takes a degree of effort to keep the car under control. The force feedback is excellent, and thanks to great sound design, you can hear the car pushing through the air when driving at speed. Notably, the rumble strips are an actual hazard now instead of being barely perceptible. Unfortunately, despite the incredible work by modders, the F1 experience in Assetto Corsa still falls short of the official games in important ways. The AI is the biggest problem. It's so heavily on rails that cars just drive straight into you if you stop on the racing line. The DRS doesn't work properly either because you can use it regardless of whether you're within a second of the next car. I love just driving laps in Assetto Corsa's F1 cars, but not so much races, and it can't replace the F1 career mode experience. The base game is showing its age a bit now, although a sequel is in the works. I'm not a big mod user generally, and if it weren't for F1 I doubt I would have bothered much with Assetto Corsa. I'm sure you already know whether the idea of modding a game to make it enjoyable appeals to you or not. If you're willing to put the effort in, Assetto Corsa could be the best game on this list. Assetto Corsa Competizione, also developed by Kunos Simulazioni, is probably the king of sim racers right now, and certainly for the GT3 and GT4 classes. It's an absolute beast of a game, and if I was to do something silly like try to talk about objective quality for games, I'd probably say this was the objective best one. It's not my favourite, but that's because GT3 cars don't interest me as much as Rally or Formula 1 cars. As a result, I'm rarely all that excited to boot up ACC and run a few laps, but when I do, I remember what I'm missing. Even with my relatively affordable wheel, the force feedback is so good I can easily imagine I'm in an actual car. The camera views are great and the helmet view has head tilt to simulate how you lean into corners. Like in Assetto Corsa, ACC nails the feeling of going over rumble strips and the sense of force required to stop these cars at high speed. There are plenty of small touches and attention to detail too, like the incredible sound design. When you go over bumps, you can hear individual parts of the car rattling. As with Gran Turismo in ACC, I can lose myself for hours just coasting around classic tracks and not even bothering to race. The default car setups are good, so I can jump into whatever car and track I fancy racing and have a good time. ACC has a few official GT licenses which are incorporated through the career mode, much like doing a season in F1 or WRC. Unfortunately, ACC's career mode is exceptionally boring. It's slow and utterly without character. You're forced to start as a trainee doing laps in different weather conditions, but the only requirement is to do clean laps, not good clean laps. And there's no attempt to teach you anything, it's just a collection of races and not much better than what modders did for Assetto Corsa. Races in career mode are long, with 30 minutes being the minimum race time, and there's a general lack of flexibility for how you set up race weekends. And the rules are strict. On one weekend I did all the practice sessions, all the qualifying, and generally did pretty well in the first half of the race. I went into the pit lane for a mandatory stop and forgot that even though I had pit assist on, I still had to manually slow down to the maximum speed before reaching the pit entry. In F1 games the pit assist does this for you and that's what I was used to. I got immediately disqualified for speeding in the pit lane and it made the last 90 minutes a complete waste of time. Weirdly, there's a pop-up that says I have the pit limiter off, but it's definitely on in the menus. Something similar happened with the ignition assist, which kept turning itself off during races, requiring me to restart my car manually if I stalled, even though the menu said the assist was turned on. Navigating menus is also far from pleasant, and the game is just generally not very welcoming. Career modes in these full sim racers, like ACC, are clearly still an afterthought, and while I'd like them to be better, I can understand the logic of focusing on the driving experience. The sim crowd are a demanding bunch, and most of them are more focused on online racing or time trials rather than careers. I'm probably in the minority for caring about careers. It feels unfair to complain about what ACC does wrong when it does so much right and is constantly being tweaked and improved based on player feedback. The game came out 2.5 years ago, and yet there was a major update released while I was writing this script. ACC is available on consoles, but I've heard it has performance problems on PS4 and Xbox One. I recommend waiting for the PS5 Series X version coming early 2022. It's a demanding enough game on PC. Now, if online racing is your thing, then iRacing has you covered. iRacing is exclusively about online racing and draining your wallet. There's a subscription fee of $13 a month, and you have to purchase cars and tracks separately, and they are around $12 a piece. I don't mind a bit of DLC, but it's shocking how little content is available in a $13 monthly subscription. iRacing supposedly has the most accurate recreations of real-life tracks in sim racing thanks to extensive laser scanning, and a lot of professional drivers practice with the game. The online league has a license system ensuring you always play in races with others of your skill level, and like Gran Turismo, it punishes poor player behaviour. iRacing seems like a good fit for those into American racing. I'm not a big fan myself, but I know iRacing has done NASCAR events and it has more oval tracks than other races. It recently released an official Mercedes F1 car too, which is by all accounts very impressive, although I haven't tried it myself. iRacing isn't exactly welcoming, mind you, with poor tutorials, a HUD from hell, and a separate launcher required to race. iRacing is for a particular crowd. I'm sure it's rewarding as all hell if you get into it, and a part of me wants to, but a larger part of me just can't be bothered. I'm not a competitive person at the best of times, so a game centred around online entirely is not for me. The final game of this video might become a personal favourite one day. Automobilista 2 uses Project Cars 2's Madness engine, and as a result it's a treat for the eyes with excellent VR. As you might expect from a Brazilian developer, the track selection has more South American influence than most, which sets it apart from the pack. Don't get me wrong, I love racing on classic tracks like Nuremberg, Monza, Brands Hatch, Spa, etc, but they pop up in every game. It's nice to race new tracks, and there are cool karting specific ones here too. And most of those classic tracks are in here now with paid DLC. Like Project Cars 2, Automobilista 2 has a great selection of cars, so if for some reason you want to race karts around the Nuremberg ring, you can. Automobilista 2 also has brilliant head lean as you go into corners. It's even better than in ACC and makes me use the helmet cam a lot. Unfortunately, Riser Studios has struggled with the most important part, the driving. The devs have been responsive to player feedback, constantly pushing big and small patches with changes to the handling models, but it's never felt quite right. Until now, maybe. Update 1.3 does feel really good. The force feedback might be the best around now. Traction control is more reliable and default setups are better. The cars are still a little too twitchy for my tastes though. The AI has been one of the game's biggest weaknesses, and while the patch promises it's been improved, it still seems quite bad. Drivers stick aggressively to racing lines regardless of what's around them, so it's like racing against 30 Max Verstappens. And in kart racing, the drivers crash easily and can never get going again. I've not played it enough since the patch to make any definitive statements, but I'm hopeful for the future with this one. At its best, Automobilista 2 feels like ACC, but with the variety and accessibility of Project Cars 2. In fact, with Project Cars 3 being a bit of a disaster, I consider Automobilista 2 to be the spiritual successor to that series. Alright, I've tried to cover a broad spectrum of games here, but I couldn't cover them all. Race Room is a sim racer from 2013 that is technically free to play, although it's more like a demo where you then pay for extra content. R-Factor 2 supposedly has impressive physics, but it's also from 2013 and is showing its age at this point. BeamNG is more like a crash test simulator, although by all accounts you can get a good rally experience out of it too. As an aside, even if you don't want to get into sim racing yourself, I highly recommend checking out the esports scene. Watching actual F1 drivers racing in F1 2020 during COVID really helped me get through some rough moments, and there are lots of official and unofficial races of high quality. I don't watch a ton of video game streaming, I guess I'm a bit old school and prefer to play rather than watch, but competitive stuff like racing is great. I'm probably second only to fighting games when it comes to what I enjoy watching on Twitch. There's even some crossover with Lando Norris, the F1 driver, now playing Halo esports in the off-season. My racing wheel and pedal setup wasn't cheap, but it's definitely been worth it. I have more fun in the F1 and WRC games than ever before, and I've been able to dive into true sims like ACC and Automobilista 2. It's almost like discovering a new genre. I still lean towards the sim-like games more than the full sims, but the gap seems to narrow with each passing week. Obviously, I'm not expecting anyone to finish this video and immediately go drop upwards of $400 on a racing setup just because I had a good time with mine, but I do hope some of you will check out sim-light games if you haven't already. The F1 series is a solid starting point. You can start with loads of assists on and gradually turn them off as you get more comfortable. You don't need to buy the latest entry either. F1 2020 is basically the same as 21, just without Breaking Point, and it's probably a lot cheaper. Likewise with the WRC games, just buy WRC 9 if you want to save money. And Project Cars 2 is often deeply discounted. Alright, that's it from me today. This is the final video of 2021. 2022 is looking very uncertain for this channel right now. I'll prepare a proper update in the new year, but you should expect content to slow down even more or stop completely at this point. I'll do my best to continue the CRPG series, but that's probably it. If you're a patron, don't worry, I will continue to pause donations in any month I don't publish a video. Okay, until next time, if there is one, cheers.